Close reading can be really difficult for younger readers, and we know what happens in a first grade classroom when something goes way over your students' heads. I don't even need to give you examples of off-task behavior or talking. You get me. So having some classroom management strategies in place during your close reading is going to help you avoid all that. That way you're proactively fighting all this off-task behavior. This video is going to give you a lot of helpful tips on classroom management and close reading. But if you do need more help with close reading, where to get started, what to teach on each day, make sure you download the free guide. It is in the description right below you. You'll have 2 weeks of lesson plans, reading passages, and what to teach on each day. And it's completely free. You can download it right now. Besides close reading strategies, in the guide there's also a space where you can jot down what you'd like your expectations and your routines to be. This is the last video in our close reading series. Make sure you subscribe to Teaching Firsties and you go back and you watch any of those videos in the close reading playlist if you missed them. Teaching close reading is difficult enough, especially if your students are daydreaming or talking or any kind of off-task behavior. Of course, as elementary teachers, we need to be one step ahead of our classrooms at all times. Like that's possible, right? Many of these classroom management strategies can be used for any lesson during the day, but I'm going to show you how I use it for close reading. Now, during close reading, we want to make sure our routines and our expectations are already in place because there are a lot of different components during close reading, and we want to make sure we avoid any interruptions. So here are 3 strategies for classroom management that will help your close reading lessons run more smoothly. Now, if you followed along during my close reading series, you'll have heard me say build hype a time or 12. And this is the biggest thing you can do to get your students excited about their close reading passage and activities. So here's how to build hype during close reading. First thing you can do is make it seem like it is the coolest thing that they'll ever get to do this year. I was pretty close with the kindergarten teacher down the hall, and it didn't hurt that I taught first grade and many of them had her last year. So I used this to my advantage. You know, I was talking to Miss Strom at lunch yesterday, and she said her kindergarten kids are so jealous that you get to do close reading and they can't. This works like a charm, especially since you're bringing up somebody that they have a relationship with, and it also makes them feel a little bit more grown up and ready to do something harder. You'll also want to treat your close reading lessons like you're unlocking a secret. If you tell your student that the author has a little secret message in here and they don't want to just tell you because that's not any fun. We have to try to find it. That's going to give them a little bit more of an incentive to do the work than just, okay, we're going to read this passage and we're going to talk about what we found. If you make this into a challenge, or better yet, a game, you'll find that your students are going to be really motivated during your close reading lessons. Now, you probably heard about student proximity. This is when you go and you just stand near a student, you don't say anything. When I'm introducing a close reading passage or we're having a discussion about new vocabulary words or phrases, and I see a student that's talking or off task, I just get up and I walk near that student. And sometimes that's all it takes. If they don't notice, you can put a hand on their shoulder or their upper back if you know that that's not going to make them uncomfortable. You never want to have an uncomfortable experience with a child. So if you know the child and you know that that isn't going to work, then just put your hand on their desk. Or better yet, you can point to the place on their close reading passage where they're supposed to be. But the point of this is to not draw any attention to it whatsoever. So I never even say a word about it. I just continue teaching and I just make sure that student gets my support. That way you're showing respect to the student who is off task by not drawing attention to them, and you're showing respect to the rest of your class by not interrupting their lessons. Over the years, I learned how to vary my voice patterns when I was teaching, and it really helped my students focus.
Because the more you vary your voice pattern, the more interesting you're going to sound.
Here's a wacky example of how I learned to do this, and it's something I would never tell my students, but I'm a huge Dateline fan. Like the true crime podcast, TV show. And I would listen to Keith Morrison tell the story, and his voice just varies and he talks very soft sometimes. And I need to work on talking slower, but he's a good storyteller. And so I'm captivated. And of course, these stories are horrible, but somehow I'm riveted just because of the way he varies his voice. And if you can get that down in your classroom, you're going to have your students pay attention. I'll never be as good of a storyteller, but the more I practiced in my classroom, the better I got, and the more I noticed my students paid attention. One of the things that really worked was talking really softly. You'll notice that your students are going to lean forward and try to listen a little bit more. So if there's something really important and you get really quiet, your students are going to kind of pick up on that. It really does work. But then during an exciting part, you can get a lot more enthusiastic and you can really get loud about it. So think best Oscar-winning performance. The more hype you have for your reading passages, the more hype they're going to have. So speaking like a storyteller, making sure you use proximity for students who are off task and letting them know that they are big shots. This is a big deal to do close reading. These are 3 really good ways to build hype for your motivation for your classroom. And hype and motivation means they're going to want to participate with you. Now let's move on to tip number 2. There are a lot of components during close reading, so you're going to want to teach your expectations for every part of that. You're going to want them to listen and pay attention when you're reading a passage. Then they're going to be doing partner work. You're going to want them to listen to each other. You're going to give them a reading passage, but you're going to want them to pay attention and follow along. You're going to give them partner work, but you want them to stay on task. Sometimes they're going to get their own materials, but you want to show them how to use a clipboard without pinching their fingers. You also want to make annotation fun, so you'll let them get markers, but you also don't want them to make a mess. And you'll want your students up and moving around, but you also need to get their attention back to you. It's a lot, right? Now, in the close reading guide that you can download, there is a place where you can jot down any of these notes and expectations so you can kind of just map out what you would want to teach, which expectations you want, which routines you would like to practice, all of that. That's going to help you stay organized. I found that if I identified problem areas first and I taught and I practiced my expectations before my students came up with some bad habits, my close reading lessons went much smoother. Here's how it works. Look at each close reading lesson and ask yourself 2 questions. What would I like my students to do? And do I see any problems that might occur? So let's look at the first question. What would you like your students to do? Are they getting clipboards to use? Are they going to pass out papers for an activity? What should they do if they need to hear the directions again? Are they having trouble figuring out where to sit if they're working with a dry erase board marker and markers on the floor? Think about how you're going to teach each of those things and teach them as if you would teach any other subject level. Now that you've identified each of those things you'd like your students to do, think about the problems that might occur. Maybe they can't find the clipboards. Maybe they don't know where to sit. Maybe they are going to use the dry erase markers, but they're going to push the marker all the way down and ruin the marker. Whatever routines or expectations that you have identified, that's what you're going to teach. And you're going to teach it like you would any other subject area. Because classroom management techniques should be taught. If you don't remember anything else, remember this. Classroom management strategies are best if you teach them just like any other academic area. Now, if you're not sure where to start with your materials. Where do you keep your materials? How will your students go gather them? How should they carry them? What should they do when they return back to their spots? How should they use them? Really go through step by step what your students would be doing with all their materials. If you're ready to start partners with your close reading, how are they going to find a partner? There's a whole video right before this one on partner work and close reading, and it's really good, and there's good techniques that you can use for any time you want to use partners in your classroom, not just during close reading. In that video, I tell you my system of how to find a partner. It's actually really fun. But also, you're going to want to have a system in place. How do they tell you when they're done discussing, or how do you get their attention to bring everybody back to your full classroom? Another thing to have in place is your transitions and your signals. If they're sitting at their desks and you'd like them back at the carpet, how will they walk over there? Because if you don't teach them how to do that, they're just going to run and spin and roll and, Signals are important too. It lets your students know when you would like their attention back or when it's time to move from one task to another. It is also really good for your students to have a signal to let you know when they're ready. Some signals you can use are maybe a chant. If you're learning about community helpers, you can say, when I say community, you say helpers, and you say community, they say helpers. And again, of course, practice this. Or I have a wireless doorbell that I push, and that lets them know that I'm ready. Identifying these things ahead of time and practicing them before they become a problem helps your classroom run much more smoothly, and your close reading lessons are going to be much more effective. So we talked about building hype for your close reading lessons, and we talked about identifying problems that you might have and teaching them ahead of time, just like any other subject you would teach. Let's move on to our last tip for building motivation during your close reading lessons. And that's varying your activities. You're going to want to make sure you mix things up day by day and week by week so your lessons just don't get stale. You could plan the best lesson of your career, but if you teach it every single day, your students are going to get pretty tired of it. And when they lose focus, they talk a lot. Or you're going to have a lot of unwanted behaviors we could have prevented. We want to keep our students on their toes during close reading, and there's a video in this playlist that has the end of the week activities, how to wrap up and bring closure to your close reading passages. And in that video, we talk about some fun activities that you can do with your students. But we also talked about making sure you didn't do the same kind of activity each week, week after week. And one of the things that's really important for classroom management, not just for close reading, but just for anything, is to recycle through your activities. If you're having your students write in their journals every single Friday, they're going to get pretty tired of it, and frankly, so are you. So instead, we might write in our journal 1 week after our close reading, the next week we'll make a craft, the week after that we might make a science experiment, and so on. This goes for vocabulary work too. Maybe 1 week you can write new sentences on dry erase boards, the next week you can make a vocabulary poster with their new words, the week after that you can have a vocabulary parade. And try switching up your close reading passages too. Vary between fiction and nonfiction. Maybe if you have a fictional story about some characters who have a lot of emotion about something, maybe somebody is sad or worried about something, the next one can be something a little bit more funny. Or find a science nonfiction passage and then you can do a science experiment with it. And again, I'm going to send you to the close reading playlist because there are 2 videos on how to choose or write your own close reading passages if you can't find your own. I think that you'll find that following these classroom management techniques will help your close reading lessons, but I bet you can use them during other times in your day too. Because remember, your goal is to stay on top of unwanted behavior and teach proactively rather than reactively. So remember, build hype for your close reading, teach and practice your expectations and your routines often, and vary your activities and your reading passages week by week. I really hope these close reading videos were helpful for you. Make sure you click like so I know that they were worthwhile and YouTube does its thing and shows it to other teachers. Make sure to subscribe to the Teaching Firsties YouTube channel so you can see what we've got coming up. Thank you so much for joining me for all of these close reading videos, and I will see you next time.